Welcome to Slimehouse, a podcast rated PG for crude humor, outrageous hijinks, double entendres, and mild language. I'm Nelson.
I'm Jasper.
I'm Jared.
I'm Max.
And I'm Dorothy.
And today we're talking about the infamous 2003 adaptation of Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat.
Conrad had a way of breaking the rules. His sister Sally had a way of enforcing them.
Hope you're going to ground him.
Yes, Sally, for a week.
But today...
Hi, Mrs. Kwan. I'll be back in a couple of hours. No one sets foot in the living room or else.
all that will change.
Who are you?
I'm the Cat in the Hat. Hairball.
Based on the seminal children's book by Dr. Seuss, The Cat in the Hat follows a crazy day with the Walden kids as they're visited by a giant, crazy cat in a hat.
So the cast of this movie is headlined by Mike Myers of Shrek and Austin Powers fame. The kids in this movie are played by Spencer Breslin and Dakota Fanning, kind of both at the peak of their kid actor kind of stage of their careers. The late Kelly Preston plays their mother, and the supporting cast is rounded out by Alec Baldwin and Sean Hayes, who are also in the movie Cats and Dogs.
Some feline fans.
So this was a movie that was produced by Brian Grazer, who was really kind of capitalizing on the success of the Grinch adaptation, which he put together with Ron Howard 3 years prior. But this one was directed by Bo Welsh, who's actually a production designer by trade for a lot of classic Tim Burton movies and really renowned for his kind of zany and really larger-than-life production style, which fits this movie a lot. Written by a team of Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm alums, Alec Byrne, David Mandel, and Jeff Schaefer. David Newman does the score, but there's also a key Smash Mouth appearance, as every Slime movie must have. The makeup and effects are actually done by Steve Johnson, who is very key to Slimehouse, as he's the creator of Slimer from Ghostbusters. But the most noteworthy name in this is the now renowned Emmanuel Lubezki, who is now a 3-time Oscar winner. And also shot one of our previous episodes, the Lemony Snicket adaptation, A Series of Unfortunate Events. This is a really interesting movie. Did you guys like this one as a kid, or is it kind of a retroactive favorite for a lot of you?
I'm going to start because I'm the only one that I don't think had not seen this before. It got lost in the shuffle of the other movies that were out at the time, and I think I've said this before when we were talking about Haunted Mansion, which came out a week after this, but I was kind of growing out of this kind of movie at the time. If this came out in 2002, a year prior rather than 2003, I think I would have been all over this movie, but I missed it, and having seen it now, it's pretty much exactly the movie I thought it was going to be when I saw trailers for it. It's just The Grinch was a hit, so let's do it again.
Actually, I forgot that this is a November 2003 movie, which is a very big month in Slimehouse. And I probably forgot it because I remember that I wanted to see this movie, and my mom's boyfriend, who took me to a lot of movies, was like, no, we're not going to see that movie. I read a review where they said that the actor voicing the fish sounded like he was rushing through his lines to get done as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting take. But I think this movie, I'm going to just qualify this so I can use it in shorthand in the future. This ended up being a ski bus movie for me, which is I would take the bus to go skiing. I've mentioned this a few times, and I would watch movies, and they were always PG movies. And this was one I caught a glimpse of on there, but I had never actually sat down and watched it. So I missed a lot of the humor in this movie.
For me, I saw this movie in theaters at the time. I don't remember having any sort of particular reaction to it. I feel like I thought it was fine, and then I left the theater and went on with my day. But in more recent years, it's sort of become a weird personal cult classic, just because I feel like it's always been free on some streaming platform or another. So it's just become a thing that me and my friends would pop on. Especially recently, a friend of mine revealed to us she was obsessed with this movie as a kid, and would even go in her garage looking for the cat and saying, "Cat, please come out. I won't tell. Come on, cat." And we just thought that was funny, so we would watch it all the time. And from that experience, it just became a movie that I would put on. That's just a weird cult classic because it's just so many. Well, we can talk about the content of the movie later, but yeah, this is a movie that I sort of developed a fondness for much later. But I did see it at the time and just kind of didn't have much of a reaction at all.
Dorothy, I've heard you're a huge fan of this film, which is why we have you on this episode.
I have so much to share about my history with this film. I'm so thrilled. From the beginning of Slimehouse as a concept and from the beginning of the podcast, I knew I had to be a part of this because I'm an eternal defender of Cat in the Hat. I loved it as a kid. Me and my sister had a DVD of it that we wore it out because we would rewind our favorite parts, which we'll get on in later scenes. We're big Mike Myers heads. We loved Austin Powers as well. But it's also kind of iconic for its DVD menu. I feel like in my memory, you know, those movies that you fall asleep on the couch, but you're too young to know how to turn off the DVD player, so you just wake up in the middle of the night and can't go back to sleep with, like, over and over again, Conrad and Sally were just arguing throughout the opening.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting DVD menu, if I remember it correctly, where one side of the screen is like the movie and its features, and that's hosted by Sally. And the other side is the making of, and that's hosted by Conrad, and they're like trying to convince you, like, you want to watch the making of, and then Sally's like, no, you want to watch the movie, and they're like arguing over it.
You think that Sally would be more defensive over the making of rather than the actual movie, because she's more into like that type of thing.
That's true.
But anyway, also
Wow.
I've lost my Cat in the Hat DVD because in middle school I went to a friend's house and, like many kids, claimed that they're scared of Cat in the Hat, creeped out by it. So I hid my DVD in her room to scare her, to give her a fright. And I never got it back.
I think I might still have this DVD, which I borrowed from a friend in high school. So he has not asked for it back 10 years later. So I can send you that DVD if you want it. I hope he's not listening to this show. Which kind of brings it back to my experience with this movie. I saw this for the first time in high school. I missed it when it was in theaters. I think on a similar note from Nelson, my parents were like, we're not going to go see that. It looks like trash. So I was actually really excited and interested in this movie because I knew that it was kind of panned, but I just, the look of it really enamored me, and just the style of it was always looked so fascinating. So I was really bummed at how bad it was when I finally watched it, because I was like, oh man, like I was kind of hoping I could be like the defender of this movie because it looked so beautiful and looked so cool, but it was definitely a disappointment for me. But kind of a fun fact, the downtown setup in this movie was actually done in the town of Pomona, California, which is a small town here in Southern California, which is one town over from where my grandparents lived. So as a kid, I think maybe a few days after they had taken down the set, they allowed people to kind of walk around and drive through, and some of the facades were still up. So we just drove through and looked at some of the facades once when I happened to be spending the night with my grandparents. So that's kind of what I remembered it for. And I actually think still some of the larger set pieces, like the big hat, or like I think there's like a wrench from the hardware store, are still available to look at on that main drag in downtown Pomona. So if you're in Southern California, take a little field trip. Nelson, you mentioned this movie came out in November 2003, which we've happened to have watched two movies from that same month, Haunted Mansion and Elf. And we've kind of identified this as really the peak right before Slimehouse's downfall. And I think this movie, out of, the four major Slimehouse movies that came out that month, was the one that really did the genre in.
Yeah, it's such an important movie for the Slimehouse timeline. And I think just because, regardless of our own personal opinions, I think this was seen as a commercial and critical failure, unable to capture some of the magic that it had hoped to in a Dr. Seuss adaptation. And I think it left a really sour taste for a lot of people that, we never saw, after that month, we never saw the proliferation of Slimehouse era titles ever again, which is pretty wild to like have a pinpoint to that.
And that isn't to say this isn't a Slimehouse movie, because this is a Slimehouse movie, which you will learn very much about in this episode. But it's the moment where I think that audiences realized that Slimehouse could only go so far before it just became obnoxious and irreverent and annoying.
It's like the frog in the boiling water. Maybe that's the Slimehouse journey is like this was the one where suddenly they were like the water is boiling.
It's like, yeah, definitely like the bubble burst moment for Slimehouse.
Yeah, it feels like this was the first. Not that there weren't Slimehouse movies that got their fair share of critical derision. I mean, Haunted Mansion just is one from this exact same month that got very negative reviews, but this feels like the first to receive such like ire, even from some people involved with the movie itself, showed disappointment and shame in being involved in it. So it definitely had a pretty historic backlash to it that even if other Slimehouse movies got negative reviews, it was unmatched.
I think it was just how high profile this movie was as well. I think because the Grinch, like I said, Grinch 2000 was such a hit that Brian Grazer wanted to replicate that, and this movie only really made like half of what the Grinch did domestically at the box office. It did kind of duke it out with Haunted Mansion for the top spot at the box office in those couple Thanksgiving weekends or so, but I think that there were a lot of like, because it was just such a big budget kind of movie, and I think this is what people remember. Dr. Seuss's widow basically did not allow any more live action adaptations after this because her personal reception.
Yeah, and I think that's part of, or maybe the main reason why this movie got such strong backlash is because on its own, I don't think it would have gotten positive reviews, but I think the fact that people saw it as such an insult to a classic piece of children's literature was like what really got people worked up about this, because the Grinch this is definitely, as we kind of mentioned, very much an attempt to mimic the success of the Grinch. It's extremely similar, both in the appearance. It's very similar. You get comedy all-star, kind of dress them up in heavy prosthetics and have them do their bit. Even the openings are almost exactly the same with like a zoom-in narration. The character types are similar with a overworked parent and a mean boss. This feels very obviously an attempt to do the Grinch, but as we kind of talked about in our Grinch episode, that movie was kind of toned down, the adult humor, because of requests from the Seuss estate, but they must have been way more hands-off with this because there's lots and lots of crude and adult humor in this, and I think people seeing that mixed with Dr. Seuss just really pissed people off.
What I love about this movie is how daring the creators were all combined to make it so insane and so in the deep end of slimy. And that's what I respect about it, is that just the people couldn't handle the slime. It seems like I think they were drowning in the slime.
Sure. I mean, like, in my opinion, like, I feel like the madness of the Grinch felt like, even though, like, as Max said, they did that tone down some of the humor, I feel like just the use of Dutch angles and color, like, I feel like it was a lot more, it was visually a little bit more original or, like, you know, striking. Maybe just because it was released first, but also I think, like, in terms of the story, there was less padding in the Grinch than there is in this. I mean, they do make stuff up, like, there is stuff in the movie that's not in the book. But I felt like this movie, by comparison, is narratively a lot more strained, too. Like, I feel like, you know, there's, in its defense, I think there's even less to work with as far as making a feature-length film in terms of plot and, like, narrative structure, but I do think there was just like it was one step even further removed from the kind of the sincerity of Seuss.
Yeah, it's almost as if instead of trying to adapt Dr. Seuss, they were trying to adapt the 2000 Grinch. It feels like it's more trying to do that and then losing in the photocopy of that, losing a lot of the what even makes that film good, which is already pretty removed from Seuss itself, so it feels even more removed from Dr. Seuss and leaning in more towards like the low-hanging fruit of kind of meta, crass humor, double entendres as it's rated PG for, and the things that probably weren't in the heart of a very short Dr. Seuss book, as Jared said.
On kind of the brevity note, I was actually a really big fan of the television special, the animated television special growing up. And that is such a fun little short. There's 4 or 5 musical numbers in a 30-minute segment, and it just works. It's not too much. It's not too little. And this actually surprised me in how much it adheres to the one-day structure. Like it just takes place over one day. It's mostly one location the entire movie in the house. I'd say 75% of the movie is in 2 or 3 rooms in this house, which is bonkers for a Hollywood, feature-length movie. But this movie is also really short. It's an hour and 10 minutes. There's a weird part of me that respects that they didn't go too far with it. Because with the Grinch, per se, like, there's a lot of padding that they do in that. But in The Cat in the Hat, there's not necessarily a lot of narrative padding. It's just a lot of, like, humor padded in there, which is overkill. But I do respect that they didn't, what they would do in later Seuss adaptations, like the Lorax, try to add, like, 4 to 5 new kind of narrative plot points.
Well, what I think is interesting about comparing The Grinch and Cat in the Hat is that they're both Slimehouse movies from a similar era, with slightly similar vibes even, but also just that they have this reputation of being terrifying to children because of the insistence upon Hollywood to make live action adaptations of Dr. Seuss books.
Yeah, which I feel like that kind of feels like a cursed endeavor from the start, is adapting it into live action. I feel like it was only bound to sort of burst after one successful movie.
What's crazy is you think it has the recipe for success based on that Grinch formula. And Bo Welch, this is his first directorial effort, but he's someone who did Edward Scissorhands, which actually has a very similar kind of hyper-real, borderline cartoonish atmosphere to his sets, and kind of a suburbia, but all very heightened and extreme, which works really well for the kind of cartoons come to life that we see. And then also the Mike Myers component, and yet it's almost like it just doesn't know what to do with itself, and has a lot of different directions it wants to go in, and wants to be funny but not Dr. Seuss funny, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, because something I sort of noted while watching it is that, and other people I believe did too, is that not only does this kind of take it over the edge from the Grinch with like its innuendos and adult humor, it really goes all in on the meta humor that's present in the Grinch, but not like suffocating. Like there's a scene where the Grinch, he references that the narrator's rhyming, or he'll say something like that, but otherwise it's pretty like minimal. But this takes that really over the top. The cat is constantly sort of breaking the fourth wall and like calling into attention different gags and stuff. It feels like it's very aware of sort of the Slimehouse tropes and attempting to poke fun at those, trying to do like a strange sort of postmodern take on the genre. And I feel like that, as much as the crude humor, is what makes it feel very not Seussian, is the super like meta humor that's like coats this entire movie.
I just want to jump in and say this. It's interesting, Jasper brought up the part about how he liked the musical numbers in the cartoon version, which I don't believe I've ever seen. But right from the get-go, the cat, played by Myers, gets a musical number, and then he kind of goes, "Oh, I can't really rhyme," ha ha ha, and then like it deflates the entire mood and tone of this song. And I think that for me, if you had to sum up the movie in a nutshell, which is another Austin Powers reference, that's like the feeling I got from the movie. It's like it doesn't work for those conflicting directions.
Nelson, what you're talking about with that opening number and like the lack of like consistency in terms of like he's doing musical but he can't rhyme, I think part of that is Mike Myers' performance in this, which rather than feeling like something wholly original like Carrie's performance in The Grinch, just feels like this amalgamation of the other roles he'd play. Like some of his like catchphrases, like "oh yeah," is like very like Austin Powers-y. Some of his like, I feel like there's a lot of like Shrek in this performance as well, in terms of like some of his other diction. And one thing that was interesting about this, after watching it and reading on it, is that like how much of this was like the movie was originally meant as a vehicle for Tim Allen, and this would have been the third or fourth movie of his we would be talking about on this show, but instead it's the first Mike Myers movie we're talking about on this show. But also, like, I didn't know about this, but he was apparently very difficult to work with on set compared to Jim Carrey as well. My read of this was that like he just was not like, I like Mike Myers, but I don't think he was putting a lot of effort into this performance in this movie. I think it was really a paycheck for him more than anything else.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting story, sort of the way this movie was made, why this movie was made. Apparently, originally, in 2000, Mike Myers was, like, pretty deep in production. They'd already got actors, paid a lot of money for a Bo Welch directed adaptation of an SNL character he did named Dieter. And like partially into the production, Mike Myers just got fed up and decided he didn't want to do the movie anymore and quit. And there was like a series of lawsuits between him and the studio, and it was settled actually. They were able to reach a settlement only if Bo Welch and Mike Myers agreed to do sort of a replacement movie for the studio, and that ended up being Cat in the Hat. So they like contractually were obligated to do this movie, which sort of explains why so little effort is being put in. I think especially honestly by the director Bo Welch, not to call him out or anything, but because he does amazing production work and has a great vision. But I think a huge difference from this and The Grinch is that movie is shot like such a zany way. We mentioned that earlier, how there's like Dutch angles, the camera's always moving around. This movie is like wild locations, some wild aesthetics, but it's shot in a very boring way, which I feel like is strange considering what a acclaimed cinematographer they have working on it.
Speaking of the cinematography, I feel like in the content of the film, it started out kind of like Wes Anderson-y, like centered shots, just trying to show how perfect and Dr. Seuss-like and book-like it is with a narrator, and like the kids are in focus and looking out the window during the rainy day, and it's all shot beautifully. And then once the cat shows up, like that's just all out. Like they just throw that out, and it's all bets are off. And they have like even the slime, even the filth looks really Dr. Seussy, really clean, just like bright purple spots all over the wall. But then randomly they'll have like a hairy cat butt crack to add into the slime factor. Just totally taking off the shiny veneer of book and make it into a Slimehouse movie made for kids with just gross humor of the time. Just completely, I feel like that's why people thought it was insulting to Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, I think the thing about this movie that makes it, I mean, Jared kind of mentioned this earlier, we were talking about, it feels like just the combination of all these characters Mike Myers has played instead of a wholly original. Something I thought while watching this is it felt more like, if anything, it felt less like a Dr. Seuss movie and more like a kid version of Goldmember. It just like had a very similar style of humor and everything to Goldmember, specifically Goldmember. And I feel like that was a movie that came out shortly before this one and was very popular, so it makes sense that they would maybe be trying to have Myers kind of channel his performance in that into Cat in the Hat.
It's barely even a kid's version of Goldmember because of how much innuendo is in this.
Yeah, it's really, because I mean, Austin Powers is already so innuendo based that a lot of these jokes would not be out of place just in Goldmember, completely unaltered.
Dirty hoe. I'm sorry, baby. I love you.
Come on, cat.
There's a review on Letterboxd, which I think is appropriate to reference as this show was birthed from Max's and Dorothy's Slimehouse Letterboxd list. But there's a really interesting review on Letterboxd by a guy named Eric Lees, and this is from his 5-star review. He calls out specifically that this movie is almost a movie for adults, that about Hollywood's kind of manipulation of children's films. And he specifically calls out the contract scene with the lawyers as being symbolic of how Hollywood sells out in adapting and, quote, bastardizing children's media for their own profit. And, you know, the way the lawyers are framed and the cat tries to make the contract sound fun and whimsical and magical, but like really there's no way you can make that into something really interesting. It's just you're bound to what, you know, where the dollars come from, which I thought was like a very interesting take on this, and made me kind of look at it through look at the movie through a lens of like, is this just kind of like a oddly postmodern, like super self-aware, surrealistic satire of Slimehouse?
That's honestly funny to think about, because now that you mentioned that contract scene, it's pretty wild. There's like a major contract joke in a movie that everyone involved was contractually obligated to make and didn't want to make at all. Like, it's just that, because I feel like that's actually interesting, and it adds credence to that sort of lens on the movie, that like the people involved didn't want to make it and probably didn't think it was a great movie to begin with. And that kind of makes, like, because it starts out such like a sort of simple storybook type movie, and once the cat shows up, it just becomes like gross out, like borderline like Freddy Got Fingered, sort of just disgusting gags. Another postmodern take on like the genre. So maybe this is the Freddy Got Fingered of Slimehouse.
I remember when I was a kid, I thought the contract scene was really funny, and I could tell that this was like an adult humor. Like, that's one of the times where I saw it and knew that this was not targeted towards me. Like, all the time, sign here, like, smell, scratch here, sniff here, and all that stuff.
The smell here part got an actual laugh out of it.
Yeah, and when he had the little thing that says, not here, and like, put it down hard.
Yeah.
I feel like as a kid, that's like your idea of humor that adults find funny, because a lot of these kids' movies do squeeze in a lot of lawyer humor, which I feel like as a kid I'd be like, oh, this must be what adults think is funny, making fun of lawyers.
I remember what a sleeper joke it was when I was a kid, when he had all the lawyers behind him that randomly showed up, and then I forget exactly what he said, if one of you all remember. He said, like, they're like fairies from another dimension or something like that. And that kind of just like was boring to me as a kid, but for some reason it got like an actual out loud laugh out of me when we rewatched it today.
Kind of in that vein of this being such a meta postmodern movie, there's a specific line that I wrote down when watching it that kind of convinced me about this movie's self-awareness. The cat says, I think that these children are smart enough to not fall for your flash of expensive content and immoral values. And that takes place after they come back from the theme park ride that the house has turned into, when they let the kind of magic smoke come out of the Thing 1 and Thing 2 box, which is a sentence that I'm sure our listeners who haven't seen this movie are like, what the fuck are you saying? But trust me, when you watch the movie, it makes a little bit more sense. But that idea of like a movie saying like, oh, these kids are not going to fall for your like sheen of a studio Slimehouse big budget adaptation, to me was just like, they know this is bad. They know this is so bonkers and wacky and off the wall that it's probably not going to work. And coming from Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm writers, to me, that does feel like something they might throw in there. But thinking of this movie in the context of like, they kind of knew what they were making did fascinate me even more as a real kind of watershed moment for the worse for the Slimehouse genre.
Actually, that brings up a good point, which is a lot of our guests think of Slimehouse as almost a derogatory term, and where they think of it as like a commercial cash grab, which is not incorrect entirely. But Slimehouse, we love Slimehouse, you know.
Yeah,
but
I like a lot of these movies.
But I think there's a point to be made when you have something like Cat in the Hat about that type of cynical filmmaking that, even though, yes, I laughed a few times and I had some shock faces during this movie, but there is a cynicism that I think is apparent regardless of its quality merit.
We mentioned something earlier, which is that there's an adaptation of Cat in the Hat that's like 30 minutes long. It's got musical numbers, is animated. And I think they're actually doing another adaptation in the future that's going to be animated as well. And I imagine that's going to be a little bit like The Grinch with Benedict Cumberbatch that came out a couple years ago, and that it won't be Slimehouse. It'll be something else.
It'll be Minion 1 and Minion 2.
Right? So it'll be illuminating. Thinking of this and Grinch 2000 as sort of like peas in a pod, I think both of these movies were slimy, whereas other Dr. Seuss adaptations we know of are not, because of the time period they came out in, obviously. But Dr. Seuss adaptations of this time were influenced by Slimehouse, is what I think. And you could also argue that maybe some Slimehouse movies were influenced by Dr. Seuss to some degree. But I want to focus on that as we segue into tropes, because I think a lot of the tropes that we see in this movie, the way they like kind of flesh out Cat in the Hat into a feature-length film, live-action adaptation, I think are very, like, that is just Slimehouse to a T, and I think they couldn't have done that without the Slimehouse kind of language that we've been talking about on the show. So, for me, the biggest thing about Slimehouse, in my kind of, like, experience with it, is that kind of kid anarchy, kind of, like, baby punk kind of attitude, and this movie has that in spades, so I think it's a good place to start. In particular, I think you see that a lot with the Conrad character, the boy in the film, played by Spencer Breslin. And when we're introduced to him in this film, he's doing this ridiculous stunt in this 2-level house that his mom owns, where he's like basically got bags of bread attached to him, and he goes down this sled, and he basically creates a stair sled, kind of like what you see in Home Alone. You see Dakota Fanning's character, his sister, just have this very like heavy sigh, kind of inducing reaction to it. The character of Conrad, he's kind of rambunctious, and he gets into a lot of messes. And I think the way they're portrayed in this movie really is a good starting point for those slime themes.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nevins, your attention please. You are about to witness the third most spectacular stunt ever performed under this roof.
Do you know how hard it's getting to tell people that we're related?
Go have no fun somewhere else.
I think another big part of this movie, sort of kid anarchy, despite the fact that he is by all means depicted as an adult character, is I think Cat in the Hat sort of represents sort of a child's desires, a child's self-conscious. I feel like they kind of will him into existence in the house by wanting to make a mess, or Conrad wanting to make a mess when their mom is away. So I feel like the Cat in the Hat, just the way he sort of goes around the house, destroys everything. He doesn't have any regards for rules or for like what is socially acceptable. Despite the fact that he's an adult, I think his entire presence just sort of has that kid anarchy feel to it, especially since he's constantly in the presence of the two kid characters.
It's like Conrad is too messy and extreme with like the food sled thingy and just making a big mess, and then Sally is kind of too stuck up and type A, and they have to like morally meet in the middle, and the cat is like the instigator for like having a fun kid spirit and finding that perfect middle ground.
Yeah, and towards the end, there's another kind of funny meta bit also referencing the contract where the cat says something along the lines of, oh yeah, you guys broke the contract, but that's all null and void because there's a clause that says if you learn a lesson about all the mess you made, then the contract is valid again, which I kind of saw as like a funny take on like kids movies, but it speaks to kind of what you're saying, Nelson, too, of like, oh, the kids in a Slimehouse movie kind of always have to like meet in the middle, and one has to learn how to be good, and then one also kind of has to learn to like chill out a little bit, which I also kind of, to me, plays into like a weird gender dynamic that we always see in Slimehouse movies. Like it's always the boy who's like the nasty, kind of rambunctious one, and often I think female characters are always seen as like very stuck up and clean and perfect, which is, I guess, kind of stereotype in a lot of media about boys versus girls, but I think it's very caricatured in a lot of these Slimehouse movies, almost to like a very dangerous effect at some points.
I feel like despite all the chaos in this movie and how much the film thinks that it's like going against all the expectations and really being edgy and rebellious against the format, it actually just follows really clear-cut children's film tropes, such as like, you know, how we're saying how Conrad is just super irresponsible and Sally's too responsible, and they're going to learn their lesson, you know, from the beginning what roles they fill, and you know that they're going to have to meet in the middle. It's just all a part of the formula, and it follows that to a T, like hidden under all the destruction.
Yeah, it even feels like the feuding siblings is something we see in a lot of these movies too, even very recently in We Can Be Heroes. We had the rewind and the fast forward characters as playing that sort of part.
One of my favorite character tropes that's coming back in spades is one that Jasper pinpointed in House Arrest, and that is the slime instigator. And we get two of those in this movie in the form of things.
I mean, you could argue the Cat in the Hat is the ultimate slime instigator.
Okay, I think he is, but then I feel like the things are like the cat's id almost. Like they're just unfiltered even more. When they come in, it just is like pure destruction as opposed to like semi-controlled demolition.
Yeah, I like that you said that because it's like the cat's is kind of the kid's id, and then the things are even further into that, the cat's id, and they have no narrative purpose other than to cause destruction. They're not characters, they don't really speak, they just look very scary and just sort of destroy everything in sight.
They're agents of chaos.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. That's the one purpose they serve in the movie is just to be the slime instigators, which I like that we're starting to see in these movies.
And they're also like a symbol for Conrad and his how he does the opposite of what he's told, but taken much more literally.
For sure. Yeah.
Super ham-fisted message.
Yeah, there's just a lot of messes. Speaking of them, their main purpose is causing messes. This is a very mess-centric movie. They're constantly making reference to the mother of all messes. And I feel like, to a kid, making a mess is such an iconic sort of experience that you sort of romanticize. So I think including such a preoccupation with messes, which we see in a lot of these movies, people making messes, but rarely is it called out as directly in this. And I feel like that's very much in that sort of kid chaos.
Whenever I was a really young kid, there was, I forgot what platform it was on, but there was a Cat in the Hat video game, which is relevant to so many slime movies, slime blockbusters. And I remember it took place like basically entirely in the Mother of All Messes. And I feel like looking back, the Mother of All Messes is pretty a small part of the movie.
Well, it's like they have to have a climax of the movie, and so they put it in this kind of like Salvador Dali-esque animated theme park ride. And yeah, it does feel very like written in to like make it a big climax as opposed to like integrated in.
Yeah, and I think just visually that looked a lot like Shark Boy and Lava Girl to me, which I think is sort of what like this movie very much is trying to do that live action cartoon. That's the only real CGI heavy moment, but I think the movie throughout is maybe one of the more direct attempts at mimicking a cartoon in live action that we've seen so far, both in the way it looks and in the tone in a lot of ways, I think.
What really puts this off the scale for me, and what really stands out as how slimy it is to me, is the literal slime throughout the movie. Whether it be the pink goo from the Cupcakeinator, or even the green hand sanitizer that Mr. Humberflube uses, and several other things. And it's so messy that they can't keep track of every single time a mess happens. And I've noticed there's a few examples of where something will have a consequence, such as when they wiped the Cupcakeinator slime off the wall with her spotted dress for the party. It stayed on there, it stained it, and it was a big deal. But then when the Cupcakeinator sprayed out onto the tray, the next shot, it was all perfectly dolloped into the compartments. It's like they just decide what has a consequence because there's so much mess to keep up with.
There's a line that references that idea, Dorothy, that actually made me kind of laugh out loud. I believe it's in the contract scene as well, where the kids say together, "All the fun we want, nothing bad can happen." And to me, that wraps this movie up in a nutshell, and kind of just the Slimehouse genre in a nutshell, really. Like, it's a space where kids can just have that anarchy, be as gross as they want, make as big of a mess as they want, and at the end of the day, you know, it'll get cleaned up, because you have to have a happy ending in a kids movie, so everything will all be a-okay. The cupcakes will make it into the cupcake pan.
Yeah, that feels very much like some like cartoon logic to me, that even though they kind of force this like climax where it's like, oh, are they gonna make it to, I don't even remember what they're trying to do in the oh yeah, yeah, and they have this whole forced climax where he has to close the crate with this lock, but yeah, there's not really any consequences in this movie. Like, a lot of stuff happens, but by the end literally everything has been reversed, and it's just a movie that sort of has none of the actions have any consequences in the long term to any of the characters. Everything's just fixed up at the end, which feels like something you see in a lot of cartoons, especially sort of the older Golden Age Looney Tunes kind of cartoons, which feel like this is trying to mimic in a lot of ways with the cat's sort of character and behavior. He reminds me a little bit of Bugs Bunny, in that he's just constantly like donning these disguises and doing these character bits and just these visual gags. There's some kind of Acme style humor with a lot of his gadgets. He has a giant pin to distract Alec Baldwin's character. At one point he gives him a giant pin that is labeled like giant oversized pin that requires two hands to hold, which feels like a Looney Tunes kind of gag. He actually reminded me a lot of another early attempt at live action cartoon, the show Lidsville.
Oh,
which is
wow.
also hat-centric. Yeah. They reminded me of, there's a genie played by Charles Nelson Riley in that, which I think Mike Myers actually said Charles Nelson Riley inspired this. And I think it reminds me a lot of that character, of that genie, which I'd consider Sid and Marty Krofft to be pretty proto-slime, so I feel like that's appropriate. I mean, they did Land of the Lost, which we discussed at least briefly before.
Definitely. See, I really like that comparison, and that's why Although I kind of also agree with what Jared said earlier about how he seemed kind of to be phoning in because he didn't want to be a part of it. I feel like his actions backstage reflect that side more. But weirdly, he also felt like I feel like Mike Myers is a creator who feels an obligation to whatever he's in, no matter how little he wants to do it, that he has to give a decent effort and pay tribute to things that he likes. Like I'm sure he was inspired by Bugs Bunny with like the daydream sequence when he's hitting the balls by the actor played by Beans. And he dresses up as that like prairie girl in the dress. And when he's dressed up as like the Rasta hippie guy.
Oh yeah.
He just has so many different personas he can fall into, and then the next shot as they're running away, he doesn't even have the disguise on. It's like Bugs Bunny in that there's no consequences. Charles Nelson Riley is obviously a big influence, and I think it's really fascinating that Mike Myers was so inspired to give the effort of these references.
Yeah, that's a good point. Where in a cartoon, you often see characters dress up, and then in the next shot, they're back to their normal Bugs Bunny or whatever, and that is really addressed here, where the cat can teleport, and that's sort of a gag. He can kind of be anywhere and then be anything, and they lean into that, and that's like where I think that almost could have worked, but it almost doesn't as well. And then interestingly, on the point of consequences, I think one of the places where the movie doesn't work as well is in The Grinch. There's a moral that the whole town kind of gets over the commercialism of Christmas and they get back to the spirit of it. Well, the kids in this movie learn a lesson, but all the other bad characters in the movie, particularly I'm thinking of the boss character played by Sean Hayes, who's a clean freak to a T. He'd actually have a really great 2020. But you're waiting for him to get like a moment where he gets totally covered in slime or something because he's such a neat freak, and they just skip that altogether and give him no kind of character development. And so it's an example where the consequences of the movie are so contained and so limited to a fault at times.
I felt the exact same way. Like, I felt like there was a suspense build up to seeing him doused with slime. It never happened.
Yeah, because you always see the bad guys get doused in slime, and you do see that in this, but not with the neat freak character. You see it with Alec Baldwin's character, who's the exact opposite of a neat freak. He's depicted as a very disgusting character. I think another thing about Alec Baldwin's character that we kind of didn't touch on yet is he fills a role I feel like we've seen before and we'll see more of, sort of the new boyfriend to the single parent or new boyfriend or girlfriend that's sort of the villain character. And a lot of the times I feel like they're redeemed in some way at the end, like the kid thought they were a villain but they weren't really. There's a movie in which Rob Riggle, I think Middle School, The Worst Years of My Life, has Rob Riggle playing a very like textbook example of this type of character. And I think Alec Baldwin's a very good one too, because he's just totally sleazy. His main goal is just to get money and to just send the boy off to military school just because he wants to. Like, he just really wants to send this kid to military school. Like, he doesn't have to deal with him if he don't want to. Like,
it's almost insulting to the mom, and I feel like this is also a key Slimehouse thing where the guy, literally you see him before he even opens his mouth, you know he's a sleazeball, and the kids do too, and he's just a complete asshole, and you can tell. And somehow the mom just doesn't realize this.
Yeah, like, I feel like the kids knowing before the adults, that's definitely slime.
Well, I guess she liked him. Sally liked him.
She falls for his tricks, and then I love when he's like, "Hey, dude," and like trying to like talk lingo to the kids. You know, feels like something you'd see in a Slimehouse movie, like the adult who's clueless and phony.
Look, pal, be a sport, and why don't you go and tidy up the living room, okay, dude?
Something that makes this movie not really... The thing that doesn't make this movie work in a lot of ways, I feel like, is it's trying to balance this sort of old-fashioned Looney Tunes-style humor with a lot of modern, gross-out, and, like, sexual humor.
There's a lack of logic and almost surreal quality to what we see in this. I especially feel that way in one of the scenes where the Cupcakeinator is introduced as, like, some sort of, like, Martha Stewart-y kind of commercial where there's, like, two cats in this commercial while the cat is also watching the commercial with the kids, and like that obviously has no logical flow to it. And then also I'm thinking of, like, right after they distract Alec Baldwin, there's this scene that just is probably the most strange scene in the film where they like escape through some sort of, like, what was it, like a telephone booth or something, and they go through this hole and they go, basically it makes no logical sense whatsoever, which could work and just kind of Monty Python sort of way, but like it's really just an excuse to have Paris Hilton cameo in the film. And I don't know if like she just really wanted a cameo and like she had enough money to pay for one, but like it doesn't work because it just feels like it feels very forced. It's also that lack of discipline between the different styles of comedy we're talking about.
Kind of on that lack of morals and lack of kind of arc to a lot of these characters. To me, this movie, to your point, Jared, is that it just feels like a string of jokes. It doesn't feel like there's any momentum in any direction, which can work in a movie. However, it's introduced in a way where you think there's going to be some kind of, storybook structure to this movie. But once, the cat shows up, just complete anarchy, logic goes out the window. And in that way, like, I am immediately lost because nobody in this movie has anything that it feels like they're working towards. And not that a movie, again, everybody has to be working towards something, but literally every scene feels like once it ends, like it didn't matter anymore.
Touching on that, that's exactly how I felt right when we started the movie with the opening title sequence, even before we even see any live action characters, is the opening titles are just styled after Dr. Seuss's illustrations. It's kind of just a cute little nostalgic with a really peaceful little song. Like, oh, this is going to just be a straightforward Cat in the Hat movie. And they just throw that out the window.
It's a literal, almost shot for shot, identical to the Grinch's opening. Actually, like slowly zooming into Whoville and introducing the Who's with the peaceful music.
Yeah, I feel like something about this movie is, like you mentioned, there are movies that can make it work when you're just stringing a bunch of gags together. I think of like something like Airplane or some of like the Marx Brothers even movies. It's like just an excuse for a bunch of gags. But this movie is sort of following a narrative, and then we'll just take a detour to have a bunch of gags, then get back to the narrative, which I feel like throws off sort of the flow. Like I feel like a scene like the rave scene might work if it were in like a Naked Gun movie or something, but in this it feels really weird and out of place because there actually is a pretty straightforward narrative, and then they'll just do all these asides with these ridiculous gags like that.
The birthday scene also feels to me like one of those odd asides. Like, you think something significant's going to happen, but nothing significant actually really happens. It's just kind of a lot of funny gags of, I guess Sally kind of gets like a nice, she realizes that she's too stuck up, so the kids don't invite her to the birthday party, but like it's really just an excuse for the cat to get knocked in the nose.
Yeah, it's just for like a classic Slimehouse like crotch hit. That's the whole scene.
Yeah, for sure.
Although, I like what Max had pointed out, because we'd mentioned earlier, Max will know better than me, that I think Armin White compared it to Hell's a Poppin', a modern day Hell's a Poppin'.
Yeah, I saw that in a review.
Which is interesting because it's not gracefully done, and I can't even say it's well done as much as I have a weird soft spot for this movie. But it is interesting that it seems like kind of a reference to old films like that, just like a string of jokes, nothing matters, just do funny shit that has no consequence.
This is a Dadaist film. Almost.
I mean, Freddy Got Fingered. That's an ultimate Dada film. So if we're talking Freddy Got Fingered, Dada, you can say for this too.
Notice how, okay, in The Grinch, there's like one big fourth wall gag where the Grinch looks and says, "Kids these days, so desensitized." But in this, almost all of the Cat in the Hat's jokes are framed as fourth wall breaks. Like, watch the way he almost always delivers his jokes, not to the children, but to the camera. And I think that balance skews it really heavily. And I definitely had some like genuine shock moments. I think the ultimate like shock, I can't believe they put this in the movie, is when he sells Universal Studios
I love
tickets.
that.
Yeah, that felt very much like it was both like a standalone joke, and Wayne's World has some very like iconic product placement, like fourth wall breaks. It felt like it was sort of a call out to that, while both also being its own weird little meta joke.
You know, for a movie that like that absorbs and takes in so much like pop culture and didn't really end up contributing very much to pop culture, it did produce a meme that I love. And I was thinking about this when one of y'all brought up the birthday party scene where he's getting hit like a human piñata. There's a meme that spawned from this movie where the cat has a baseball bat and he's prepared to hit the kid that hit him in the groin with the big baseball bat. Do you remember this? This was like a meme for a while.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I remember.
I've never
like
seen
the
this
meme
one.
where that's like where like you think you think things are going well and then something bad is gonna happen and it's like right behind your back. And like
that's a good setup.
Yeah,
see
so this was a meme
I
for a
see
long
it
time.
right
If you're
now,
gonna know your
actually.
meme, it's gonna be there. But like the Cat in the Hat holding the baseball bat, being ready to hit the big hit, the birthday party, and it's just kind of like it's a
Yeah, it'll be
bizarrely
like
ominous scene
2020
in
is
the
the
movie.
kid and like COVID is the baseball.
Yeah,
bat.
that. So like it's
Yeah.
just a bizarrely ominous like shot in the film, and like whoever was making the meme, like they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a weird amount of humor in this movie that involves like the cat being like a total psychopath that has like nothing but resentment for like children, which I think is very funny and sort of like adds on to this sort of being like a anti-slime movie that like this character that's brought in is like the instigator of fun just like has no regard for these children's actual well-being, and at one point even like, I mean, I know the kid hit him, but at one point plots to like kid a child with a bat. He threatens a dog. He says time to die to a dog, and just overall he's like they keep hinting that he's like actually a very dark character, which is something that I think is weird about the movie.
In the Martha Stewart scene, he's always talking about murdering his sort of alternate self in a very like, he's like, I'll make it look like an accident.
Yeah.
Several times the cat acts like there's only several options. I think twice in the movie he lists out options that they have, like, and he's like, there is a third option, murder.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But then
like,
also
he makes many
a line
references to murder.
a line that sums up, I think, his weird. He has this fondness for the kids where he actually wants them to be better people or learn a lesson. But then there's also the time where he says, Plan B, cut the losses and ditch the kids. I like the sound of Plan B.
I'm starting to really get on this like groove we're talking about, or like Max specifically, where like this would legit be a better movie if they got Tom Green to play the cat. Like, I'm just thinking about this out loud right now. It would be he would fit like the actual like tone of the character if there is one, and like he has like that kind of like uncomfortable misanthropic kind of like humor they peppered this movie with. Like, I think he would do better with that.
Yeah, I think we should remake it with
Release the green
Tom
cut.
Green. Yeah, the green cut.
It makes you want to re-edit the trailer as like a straight up horror movie, which I think would be really easy to do.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I guess if we're talking about the dark humor in this movie, I feel like it also is natural that we talk about the great amount of sexual innuendos in this movie that I think are kind of what it's mostly remembered for, at least like is how just lots of inappropriate for the target audience, like sexual jokes in this movie. The most noteworthy is definitely there's a scene with a very clear erection joke where the cat picks up like a picture of the mom and he's kind of like hubba hubba, like does a real cartoonish reaction. And he folds it out in a way that's very much meant to mimic like a Playboy centerfold, and his hat does like a boing effect and like stiffens out. And it's even more obvious every time I see it. I'm always shocked by how like blatant of like a pretty dirty joke. Like I think that would be like more, like we were saying, way more fit to something like Goldmember, which is a way more vulgar adult-centered movie. It's honestly just very surprising to see. I mean, there's dirty jokes in a lot of these movies, but just a straight-up reference to like an erection is not something I feel like you expect.
It was in the trailer for the movie too. Like,
yeah,
like
I think
the
I
whole-
remember it.
And like, Spencer Breslin.
And it's the mom, which is this other kind of pornographic element.
Yeah, because they do a whole scene where he's like awkward like after he's told, which also feels like a weird attempt at like modern humor.
Yeah.
And I don't like thinking that the cat is a sexual being.
Yeah, I know.
And when he goes into the rave and is looking at Paris Hilton, he's like checking her out, and she's wearing like this little skimpy outfit.
Yeah, it's very weird. And he also, there's a scene where he has like an actual hoe, and he refers to it as a dirty, he like grabs it and he's like, you dirty hoe, and then he's like, I'm sorry, I love you, baby, like picks it back up, and that's another very weird
And he like licks it.
Yeah, he licks it, another weird sexual.
When I was a kid, I specifically remember I was in the Little League baseball dugout, and this kid, Austin Alfaro, was like, have you guys seen Cat in the Hat? he makes a joke about hoes. And I was like, huh? Like, it's like, what are you talking about, man? So that was an awakening for me. Mom and Dad, sorry you heard that on the show.
Well, it's the joke I remember being like, let's sum it all up in one moment of like they missed the point of Dr. Seuss altogether. He has something called a dirty hoe in one scene.
This movie planted the seeds that Tom Hooper would grow for 16 years with these uncomfortable, horny cat characters.
We could say the hoe planted the seeds.
Oh, yeah.
The hoe tended the crops.
Yeah. I wonder, do you think Tom Hooper's seen this movie? That's actually interesting.
100%.
Yeah.
He probably loved it.
I mean, this was an influence on cats, I guarantee it.
Yeah.
Even the scale being funny of things.
Yeah.
And like,
the fact that the actors' faces look like virtually unchanged despite being cats. That's
I'm sure I'm not the only one for whom this film was a sexual awakening, not in a good way, in a way of it broke my innocence.
Mm-hmm.
Because the sexual jokes were so ham-fisted that, like, I got them even as a kid. I was like, this isn't right. The way they're saying this, it has to do with something I shouldn't be listening to. I felt dirty, even if I didn't know exactly what it was talking about. Like, I got the vibe. I wasn't clueless. And I was a very young child when this came out.
Even in the contract scene, there's the spayed and neutered bit, which is just like...
I think he, like, referenced he's gonna say balls. He, like... implies he's gonna say balls during his song about having his balls cut off.
And there's another, again, it's a mix of the ones that are like so on the nose and then some more subtle ones. At the end he has a bunch of tennis balls and he smells them and it's like, it's got that new ball smell.
Oh, I took that as a very innocent, when you get a new tennis ball or new baseball or soccer ball, there's like a legitimate, like really nice
I
smell.
know that, but like read it out loud. I mean,
yeah, I feel like in a vacuum, I would think that, but considering like this movie's sense of humor, it also read to me as like a testicle joke.
I agree with Nelson. I felt like dirty myself because I feel like the film had set me up to believe this was sexual, because also he like smelled the ball and then his he like closed his eyes and his like legs shook. It was weird. I didn't feel good about it.
Ew.
yeah, it's funny because in The Grinch, I was so like clutching my pearls when the dog like gets kissed in the butt, but that would just be like par for the course in this movie.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked about how like a lot of these Slimehouse movies have like dirty jokes or jokes that are meant for like the parents, but this movie like a lot of the humor is that it's not like they're just peppered in there, and I feel like that's kind of this takes it over the edge even from the typical Slimehouse dirty jokes, and that this is just chock full of dirty jokes that are too dirty to even almost be considered innuendos. They're just there.
And I think in that way that like this movie's jokes and its humor is so adult and so dirty and so crass, I think is really what, made it kind of destroy Slimehouse for a second. Whereas like Slimehouse, as we've kind of seen it, is about, butts and farts and poop and burps and, the things when you're 5, you're supposed to say, I tooted instead of I farted. Like, but in a Slimehouse movie, you can say fart, like whatever. This just takes it to a whole nother level where not only is it hard for a kid to understand, an adult is like repulsed by it in some ways. So it doesn't work for anyone. It just works on this like weird, crude, kind of dark anti-humor level that in some ways is enjoyable. But as a commercial film, it doesn't work. And I think at this point, probably a lot of parents and a lot of kids were like, oh, I don't want to go see, even though Slimehouse was not a term back then, I don't want to go see that Slimehouse movie. Like, those are nasty, like this brought the nasty up to a level so much that like, this is maybe like a weird metaphor, but like when I was a kid, I drank Sunny D because that's what a lot of people bought. But there was one time where I drank Sunny D and I threw up. And now I just associate the taste of Sunny D with barfing, so now I can't drink it. People associate Slimehouse with a movie like this that just kind of leaves a really bad taste in your mouth, and then they just kind of want to avoid it altogether. And I think that that's really what this movie did for the mass audiences. But it is kind of interesting to see it gain this cult following in recent years and this kind of revisionist history of what it was trying to do.
Yeah, I feel like there's also a lot of that classic Slimehouse. Not as much as we've seen in some stuff, but a lot of that classic Slimehouse sort of emasculation of humor. The cat at one point has like coconut shells, like a coconut shell bra in, which I feel like is presented as like inherently funny. He's dressed up as a woman, and there's one scene where he holds up a dress and just says in a high-pitched voice, "Look, I'm a girl," and that's the joke, which feels like a very weird scene. And even the fact that like the mom's precious item, which I kind of put in when I was watching it, when Nelson talked about I think he called it the Chekhov's precious item and house arrest with the champagne, and I feel like this kind of fills that role. But the fact that like the one thing that was most important to this mom was this dress also feels like some of that.
Materialistic.
Oh, I have to bring up the dress joke where the kids say, "You ruined mom's dress," and then Mike Myers in his like girly voice was like, "It was ruined when you bought it." Snaps.
Yeah, that's a joke I always remembered really well from this movie.
That was one of the parts I rewound as a kid. That was my favorite part. He says, "Honey, it was ruined when she bought it."
Yeah, that's a good voice.
That's very funny. Kind of what you're talking about, I think, is an interesting parallel to something Jared brought up in our episode about the Grinch and how Whoville is kind of oddly like Americana-ish, not visually, but just the way it kind of functions as a town. And in The Cat in the Hat, it also, the town and the social structure is also very kind of like that classic 50s, 60s Americana.
That's interesting, but I felt like the Grinch was meant to be, the Whoville was meant to be very nostalgic because of Ron Howard's kind of like thumbprints and having been on Happy Days. This, while watching it, like the suburbia depicted here has a lot of like cars that became the kind of like sedans and like cars that became very popular in the early 2000s, and also like there's a Hummer introduced in this. So
yes.
I thought watching this felt much more like this was not nostalgic. This is like trying to be in 2003, and all the humor and the Paris Hilton cameo and the pop culture references, all that reinforces that. But like it's an interesting parallel for sure.
I totally hear you, and I agree with that. I think kind of what I'm thinking in general is kind of just how the town is set up in terms of kind of like perfect cookie cutter suburbia, which is also kind of parallels Bo Welch's work on Edward Scissorhands with the really candy colored houses, perfect suburb, you know, the neighbors kind of all know each other. And then you kind of have that like fun small town downtown. There's something odd about kind of this like perfect kind of town that is uprooted by this crazy maniac character. And that's a lot of Dr. Seuss's, you know, hand in it. That was one of his big things, is chaos that he was so good at showing in a way that was so artful, but was misinterpreted in the new millennium as, oh yeah, chaos is just making messes and making things go all over the place.
That's a really good point about the difference between Grinch's Americana, because one of the reasons Grinch has aged really well, A, it's a Christmas movie, so it has a perennial value to it, but B, it doesn't have any pop culture references, so it does feel very timeless. And it also takes place in this kind of non-world, right? It's a snowflake, and there's nothing about the real world in it. And to that movie's credit, that allows it to age very well, because it could have been made last year, or it could have been made 50 years ago. But Whoville in this movie, whether it's Whoville or Whatville or Whyville, it's not quite removed from it. One example is the universal joke, and then I actually want to share one of the jokes that I did laugh out loud at, which is when they're driving, they're trying to get there, and the Cat in the Hat says like, "Oh look, Rhode Island plates. You never see those."
I knew Nelson was gonna love that joke. I think I wrote down, this is Nelson's favorite joke.
I wonder, that's amazing that you know that about me, but yes, that was my favorite joke.
I feel like because Slimehouse is so inspired by the Americana suburban family, we all know the general format, and this includes some tropes for Slimehouse families, which the main family in this movie falls under is a single parent. Often it's unexplained why they're single, which in this case it is. Second is they have pets, and Nevins is the perfect dog who does Slimehouse reactions, the human-like reactions, like when Conrad is about to do his indoor stairs luge, the dog throws his paws up over his eyes and whimpers. And there are several other reaction shots there. And the goldfish, who's always just basically fills Sally's role of just not wanting to get into trouble, and which is kind of strange that he's just talking and the kids don't question that, although they're scared of the talking large cat. But yeah, I just feel like there are so many little tropes that don't really fit in, just were thrown in there because it makes sense for a Slimehouse movie.
You mentioning that earlier, Nelson, about the pop culture references in this movie that are not in The Grinch. I think that actually made me just think of something that I think a very important movie that fell between The Grinch and this is another Mike Myers movie, is Shrek. I think was one of the major like family movies that really
another Mike Myers movie
introduced. I feel like that very much introduced a lot of or popularized filling these kids movies with these pop culture references. I remember there's a Matrix joke in Shrek that like got a lot of mileage. I feel like people thought that was super funny, and so I feel like putting in all these pop culture references to adult pop culture is something that sort of the Shrek effect, I guess you could call it, that I think had a major impact on Slimehouse, and actually ended up, I think that's something that kind of watered down Slimehouse, was weighing it down with all these references, and I think that's a major weakness to this movie, and I think that's something that sort of brought down the innocence of Slimehouse.
One of the things we talk a lot about in these Slimehouse movies, and one of my favorite subjects on a personal note, are kind of the DIY gadgets and, you know, the bizarre kind of analog gadgetry that occurs in a lot of these movies. And in this one, I totally forgot that this is maybe some of the cream of the crop in terms of, you know, just the bizarre gadgets that appear. We already referenced the cat's funometer. There's the Cupcakeinator, which is actually kind of similar to the breakfast machines that we've talked about a lot. So that could be an honorable mention on our top 10 breakfast machine lists. And then, of course, there's the cat's vehicles, his car, which is called the Slow, the SLOW, which is just like a straight up Dr. Seuss, you know, vehicle brought to real life, which I think is actually a really cool piece. And then there's his cleaning machine at the end called the DIRT, the Dirt. And just, I don't know, there's something so fun about, first, Dr. Seuss's kind of visualization of kind of how, you know, technology will, you know, improve in the future in that kind of whimsical sense. But then it also kind of relates back to this, like, his funometer almost kind of looks like something you could make at home with, like, things that you find in your house, like a stethoscope and, like, a weird crane mechanism that your dad probably has in his workshop. And for that reason, yeah, I think this movie really sits nice and pretty with a lot of the other kind of do-it-yourself whimsical gadgets we've seen.
There's also even like a little cool to kids gadget that reminded me a lot of like little Spy Kids gadgets that they'd have when the crab locks the crate.
Yes.
Because it jumps around and Conrad literally says, "Oh, cool." So.
Yeah, that's funny you bring that up, because in the back of my head I also thought, oh, that's a very Slimehouse delivery, but it was so subtle that I didn't think it was worth bringing up. But I'm glad you brought that up.
And his fascination with it, other than him opening it, never is extended, other than just he thought that it looked cool, so he messed with it. It even was personified. It had its own little emotions, like got grumpy when Conrad was trying to stick the bobby pin in it.
It does remind me of the Spy Kids like pet that he has. I've been a long time since I've seen those, but he has a little like froggy thing, and so just the cute little like techno toy.
And to go to Fanny, and she's repping BlackBerry for all y'all buying BlackBerry stock right now.
Took notes on that for sure. Like that kind of, like I said earlier, this feels so 2003 to a fault, and like, you know, that was one aspect that I took in my notes, and I'm glad it came out in this episode because we can't unpack everything about this movie.
Sorry, I want to correct myself. It's not a BlackBerry, it's a Palm Pilot.
Got me.
There's a great little in joke because she, at the beginning, you see her making a to-do list on it, and one of the things is make a to-do list for tomorrow. And so there's a joke that like you can make to-do lists, but you don't know why you make to-do lists, and it sort of speaks to this technology that like didn't really have a point yet, but was like a predecessor for the iPhone that we now use constantly.
Speaking on the kind of the dirt machine and the crab lock, both of these come into play when in the climactic scene when the box that Thing 1 and Thing 2 live in unleashes kind of havoc on the house and creates the mess of all messes, which is basically this alternate dimension that we talked about, that Alec Baldwin, the kind of villain of this movie, the neighbor next door who's dating the mother, kind of falls into as well, and he gets completely slimed in this alternate dimension in this nasty purple slime that kind of reminds me of that gack stuff that Nickelodeon used to sell. And there's a great scene where he gets spit out of a drain pipe, just covered in this like nasty purple goo. And to me, just the image of him covered in this goo that sticks to his hands when he gets, mad and puts his hands on his face is just Slimehouse in a frame, to me.
You know that he's a bad guy when he has pet allergies.
That's true. We talked about that. Was it House Arrest? We had the pet allergies. Monkey
Christopher
Trouble.
McDonald's. Yeah, multiple movies.
Yeah, it's truly a Slimehouse when he gets pushed out of the drain and dunked with purple goo, which is the ultimate way to get a villain in this genre.
That really is. If one shot represents Slimehouse, it might be that one. You have Alec Baldwin, who's been in some slimy films. I'd say can be a pretty slimy actor. And you got the suburban sort of perfect house, this cartoonishly perfect suburb, and then just slime being spewed into it. I think that represents slime in a nutshell very well.
Slimehouse, mind you.
Yeah, it's an actual house of slime.
And we will see stuff like this again.
Mm-hmm.
A proper depiction of how this film metaphorically released slime upon society to the point where it flooded and couldn't handle it is if we imagined the decor of the house and a door sliding open, a la The Shining, and the purple slime all pouring out in slow motion.
I love that. The cat is Jack Nicholson, and
I pictured that when Max said that.
Mm-hmm.
All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Makes Cat a dull boy.
There's a scene in that movie where like Shelley Duvall sees a room where there's a guy and someone in a mask.
Oh yeah, the guy in the bear costume or dog costume.
I feel like that they warped in from the Cat in the Hat.
It's also a pretty similar costume, similarly dingy and unpleasant to look at.
Similar reaction. It's a horror. That's how many people reacted to seeing the cat for the first time.
Get you, and I'll look like a bloody accident.
I think it's just about time to move into some slime scores, but we'd be remiss to talk about a Slimehouse movie if it doesn't have a Smash Mouth song in it. And this one has a Smash Mouth tune, which I did not remember, but it's a Beatles cover, which is kind of funny. And I think it's actually a very appropriate Beatles cover because there's lyrics about how school is lame. Not literally, they don't sing that, but it's the song Getting Better while they're cleaning the house and making it better. I am consistently baffled at how many movies feature Smash Mouth.
This actually has two Smash Mouth songs. Just the end credits song is also an original song. So you get the cover and the original, which also is something you see in Shrek. You get Smash Mouth and the original, not made for Shrek, but an original song. Then you get the Monkeys cover.
And the other musical trope that appears adjacently in here is a quick mambo number. I don't believe it's mambo in this. I think it's like a samba, closer to something more bossa nova flavored, but that tropical kind of music always shows up in these movies.
And he has a drink. He has a fancy drink with a crazy straw. I feel like that again shows this the ultimate fantasy is pina coladas on the beach kind of thing.
This movie has something in it that makes it come full circle with Home Alone, and that's the lactose intolerance gag. And when John Hughes started Slimehouse, he put so much dairy in the movies, and now with Cat in the Hat, in this twilight of Slimehouse that Cat in the Hat represents, the lactose intolerant have their day, and the cat has a problem with lactose, and he drinks milk at some point, and I knew that milk would come back to haunt me, and even burps. So
All right, guys. I'm a little slimed out, so let's do some slime scores. Dorothy, do you want to start us off as our special guest?
I have a feeling it's not going to be controversial, but also it's slightly hard to say, but my heart is leading me towards a 10.
Yeah, I think I'd have to echo that. I think for me, this is a 10 on the slime scale. I think it just sort of, we already all gave The Grinch very high scores, and I think what kind of brought us down from giving The Grinch perfect 10s was the fact that it had so much heart to it. It's a pretty like sentimental movie. This really strips The Grinch of all sentimentality and just fills it with gags and gross outs and cartoon style humor. And for me, I think despite the fact that we've kind of talked about this as being sort of a postmodern kind of anti-slime, it's very much key slime to me, and I'd give it a 10. It's just all the slime stuff cranked all the way up. A 10 for me.
Listeners may recall that I gave The Grinch a 9 just because I felt like there was like one missing piece that just couldn't quite get me there. And in hindsight, I really am glad I did, because Cat in the Hat is 10 out of 10 slime, and always wanted to play devil's advocate and kind of affirm my arguments. I was sitting there as the credits started, and I was like, is it a 10? Well, and then suddenly a Smash Mouth song dropped, and I was like, yeah, it's a 10. Case closed.
I also, this is a big 10 for me. We've talked a lot about like how, this was the peak of Slimehouse right before the end, and how this is the movie that kind of one Slimehouse movie to rule them all. It just cranks everything up to not even 11, 12, 13. This is up to 100. It's like it's so bright, it's so bold, it's so unabashedly anarchaic, and this is Slimehouse in a nutshell. Like every frame of this movie you could put in the Slimehouse Museum as the Mona Lisa.
Well, it's down to me, isn't it?
Oh no.
Well,
don't fuck it up.
When we had an hour and a half long episode where we don't even mention the hairball scene, I have to bestow upon this the first perfect 10 across the board.
Yes!
Oh, yes, finally.
Perfect.
It's our first perfect 10 all across the board, and we even had a guest, and as our listeners know, sometimes our guests throw huge wrenches in our slime scores, so even with that parameter, it still hits the 10 mark.
And I think part of it too is just we know intrinsically like the role this movie played in the Slimehouse timeline, and it has such a unique sort of role in the evolution of this genre, or de-evolution of it, that like I think that's why we all just kind of are so on the same page about it.
Yeah, this movie was definitely the very forefront of my mind when I even thought of what Slimehouse was and put together the Slimehouse list. I think a lot of it was informed by this movie, so it's only appropriate for it to receive such high marks.
I just want to say thank you all. I feel very honored to have been a part of this historic moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. We're glad to hear glad to have your expertise on the cat.
Let there be no doubt about that.
Oh yeah!
All right. Thank you everybody for listening and for enjoying this historical perfect 10 with us all. And stay slimy. Slimehouse, a podcast created by Jared Anderson, Jasper Birnbaum, Max Morris, and H. Nelson Tracy. If you like this episode, you can find more fun on slimehousepod.com. Our website is created by Brian Hume of Valencia Creative Company. Our theme music composed by Greta Russell. Support this podcast at anchor.fm/slimehousepod or by following us on social media at slimehousepod on all platforms.